There is a specific kind of silence that you only find in the mountains at 6 a.m., a heavy, mist-laden quiet that settles over the water like a blanket, where the only sounds are the rhythmic lapping of the waves against the pilings and the steam rising off a mug of black coffee. But that silence, the very peace I had spent 25 years in the Marine Corps dreaming about, was shattered on a Tuesday morning by the sharp, aggressive staccato of high heels digging into soft cedar wood. I looked up from the engine block of my restored 1978 Grand Banks, a vessel I had spent 3 grueling winters stripping down to the hull and rebuilding with my own 2 hands, only to see a woman standing on the edge of my dock, her face twisted into a mask of manufactured outrage, pointing a manicured finger at me like a loaded weapon. This was Brenda Holloway, the self-appointed queen of the Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association, a woman who treated our quiet, 40-acre lake community not as a neighborhood, but as her personal kingdom where she was judge, jury, and executioner, and she was currently screaming about aesthetic violations and unauthorized watercraft, while literally trespassing on the private property that had been in my family for 2 generations. "This eyesore is gone by the weekend, Elias," she hissed, her voice cutting through the morning mist like a rusty saw, waving a thick envelope of legal threats in my face. "Or I'm calling the sheriff, levying fines that will bankrupt you, and placing a lien on that dilapidated cabin you insist on living in." She didn't know it then, standing there in her designer blazer that cost more than my first car, smelling like aggressive potpourri and entitlement. But she was digging her own grave with every word that left her mouth, because what Brenda didn't understand, what she hadn't bothered to research in her rush to exert power over a retired logistics officer, was that the water she was pointing at, the lake she claimed to be protecting, didn't belong to the community, it didn't belong to the HOA, and it certainly didn't belong to her. Let me rewind 18 months, back to when I first inherited this place from my Uncle Silas, a man the family always whispered about as being eccentric or a hermit, mostly because he lived alone in the mountains and refused to own a television. But Silas wasn't crazy, he was just tired of the noise, much like I was after 2 decades of managing supply chains in conflict zones from Fallujah to Kandahar. The cabin was modest, a rough-hewn timber structure with a drafty kitchen and a porch that leaned slightly to the left, but the view was million-dollar perfection, a teardrop-shaped body of water reflecting the snow-capped peaks of the Sapphire Mountains, a place where time seemed to slow down, or at least it did until Brenda and her husband Gavin moved into the McMansion 3 doors down. Gavin was a nervous man who desperately wanted to be on the zoning board, and Brenda was a high-end real estate agent who viewed the world through the lens of property values and curb appeal. And from the moment she took over the HOA presidency, she decided that my cabin, my boat, and my very existence were a blight on her vision of a luxury lakeside community. The first violation notice arrived on creamy, thick cardstock, informing me that my boat, my pride and joy, the thing that kept my hands busy and my mind quiet when the memories of the service got too loud, was in violation of Section 14, Paragraph B regarding visual harmony, claiming it was too large, too industrial, and too aggressive for the serene nature of Silver Creek. I attended the emergency meeting she called, walking into her pristine, white-carpeted living room with my notebook and a thermos, feeling the eyes of her sycophants, 3 retirees who were terrified of her and Gavin, who sat in the corner looking like a man waiting for a tax audit, burning into me as Brenda fired up a projector to display a slideshow of my life. She had taken photos of my boat from low angles to make it look looming and ominous, distorted images that made my classic cruiser look like a battleship, and as she lectured the room about undesirable elements and transient residents, glancing at me with a sneer that suggested my military pension somehow made me second-class trash, I felt that old, cold calm wash over me. The same focus I used to feel when a convoy was going sideways. "Mrs. Holloway," I said, keeping my voice level, "the way you speak to a spooked horse or a hostile insurgent. I've read the bylaws, specifically the covenants filed with the county in 1985, and there is no mention of boat length, only a vague reference to nuisance, which is subjective. It's implied," she snapped, her smile tightening. "And as president, I interpret the implications. Besides, we all know that military types bring baggage, and we have families here who don't need to be subjected to your noise and your machinery." The room went deadly silent, the air sucked out of the space by the sheer audacity of her prejudice. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't about a boat. This was about a bully who needed a target, but she had made a fatal error in target selection, because if the Marines taught me anything, it's that you never start a war until you know the terrain better than your enemy. I left that meeting with Mrs. Higgins, a retired librarian who lived next door and made cookies that could bring peace to the Middle East, and she grabbed my arm as we walked down the gravel driveway, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, saying, "Silas was a smart man, Elias. He kept boxes of paper in that basement, maps, deeds, letters from the 60s. Maybe you should look at history before you fight the future." That night, instead of sleeping, I went down into the musty, spider-webbed crawl space that Uncle Silas had used as an archive, pulling out dusty banker's boxes labeled in his precise, architectural handwriting, sifting through yellowed receipts and fading blueprints, looking for anything that could help me get Brenda off my back. What I found was a rabbit hole of legal documents, a paper trail that started in 1962 when the original developer of Silver Creek went bankrupt, and Silas, who everyone thought was just a poor hermit, had quietly stepped in to buy assets that no one else wanted because they didn't see the value. But Silas saw something else, something future-proof. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Brenda's entire kingdom was built on sand. But I needed to be sure. I needed confirmation before I pulled the trigger on what looked like a nuclear option. So I kept my mouth shut. I smiled when she left another threatening note on my door, and I let her think she was winning. Because the best ambushes are the ones where the enemy walks right into the kill zone thinking they're attending a victory parade. The harassment didn't just escalate. It mutated into something vicious, a systematic campaign designed to break me psychologically and financially, proving that Brenda Holloway wasn't just a neighborhood busybody, but a woman possessed by the need to destroy anything she couldn't control. 3 days after the meeting, a city inspector named Mr. Henderson showed up at my property, looking apologetic and weary as he explained that an anonymous source had reported my dock for structural instability and safety hazards, forcing him to spend 4 hours measuring every plank, bolt, and piling while Brenda watched from her balcony through binoculars like a suburban sniper. "It's cleaner than my own deck," Henderson muttered, shaking his head as he signed off on the inspection. "Whoever called this in is wasting taxpayer money. But between you and me, Mr. Thorne, these types of people don't stop until they get a reaction, so watch your back." The reaction she wanted was anger. She wanted the unstable veteran outburst that she had already pitched to the neighbors. So when I found sugar crystals crusted around the fuel cap of my boat the next morning, a clumsy, amateur attempt at sabotage that would have destroyed my engine if I hadn't been rigorous about my pre-start checks, I didn't scream. I didn't storm over to her house. I simply took a sample, bagged it, and called the police to file a report for vandalism. My daughter, Mia, drove up from the university that weekend, her sharp legal mind already honing in on the injustice of it all. And when she saw the petition to remove unsafe elements that Brenda had circulated, a document signed by her husband Gavin, her manicurist, and 3 people who didn't even live on the lake, Mia's eyes went cold in a way that made me proud. "Dad," she said, scrolling through the local community Facebook page where Brenda had posted a long, rambling diatribe about protecting our children from dangerous men with military-grade equipment. "She's crossing into libel territory here. She's practically accusing you of being a domestic terrorist because you own an old boat." "Let her talk," I said, spreading the documents from Uncle Silas's basement across the kitchen table, the smell of old paper and dust mixing with the scent of the Thai takeout we'd ordered. "Because if I'm reading this correctly, Mia, she's not just wrong. She's criminally liable for trespassing every time she dips her toe in the water." We spent the next 48 hours building a war room, cross-referencing the faded deeds with modern county records. And that's when the picture became clear. Back in the 60s, when the development company folded, they sold the lakefront lots to homeowners, but they sold the submerged lands and water column separately to recoup losses. Uncle Silas hadn't just bought his cabin. He had purchased the lake itself, parcels A through Z of the waterway, the lakebed, the water rights, and the exclusive right of navigation, meaning that technically, legally, and irrefutably, every drop of water in Silver Creek was private property belonging to the Thorne estate. I called Sarah Jenkins, an old friend from the JAG Corps who was now a shark of a property attorney in Denver, and when I sent her the scans, she called me back within 20 minutes, her voice trembling with the suppressed laughter of a lawyer who knows she'd just been handed a royal flush. "Elias," she said, "do you realize what you have here? You don't just own the water. You own the land under their docks. You own the swimming rights. You own the view essentially. They have been squatting on your property for 30 years. But Brenda, oblivious to the guillotine hanging over her neck, decided to go for the kill shot, initiating a lawsuit against me for diminished property value and emotional distress, demanding $50,000 in damages and a court order to seize my boat for destruction. She even brought a local news crew to the edge of my driveway, a young reporter named Tyler with too much hair gel and not enough journalistic integrity, who stood there nodding as Brenda wept crocodile tears about how fearful the community had become, painting me as a looming shadow over their paradise. It was hard to watch, hard to sit there and let them drag my name through the mud, to see Gavin smirking in the background as he supervised a contractor measuring my shoreline for a massive, illegal boat lift he was planning to build, thinking he had one, thinking the old soldier would just pack up and fade away. I texted Sarah Jenkins, "Is it time?" She replied, "Let them file the lawsuit. Let them put it on the official record. Let them swear under oath that they have jurisdiction." Then we dropped the hammer. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like ozone before a lightning strike. And as I watched Brenda hand out flyers for a town hall accountability session, where she planned to publicly humiliate me and force my eviction, I felt a strange sense of pity. She was playing checkers, moving her little red pieces with aggressive arrogance, completely unaware that she was sitting at a chessboard across from a grandmaster who had already mated her king 10 moves ago. The accountability session was held in the Silver Creek Community Center, a sterile room with fluorescent lighting that hummed like a trapped insect, packed to the rafters with neighbors who had been whipped into a frenzy by Brenda's fear-mongering campaign, along with the news crew, Gavin, and the entire HOA board sitting on a raised platform like a tribunal. I walked in at 7 p.m. sharp, flanked by Sarah Jenkins and my daughter Mia, carrying a single, battered leather briefcase that contained the legacy of Uncle Silas, and as I took my seat in the front row, the room went quiet, a heavy, judgmental silence broken only by the shutter click of the reporter's camera. Brenda stood up, smoothing her skirt, radiating the confidence of a predator who has cornered its prey, and launched into a prepared speech about standards and the cancer of noncompliance, pointing at me as she listed my sins: the boat, the noise, the refusal to bow to her authority. "We are a community of laws," she declared, her voice echoing off the cheap drywall. "And Mr. Thorne believes he is above those laws, acting as if he owns the place, disrupting our shared resources with his arrogance, which is why we are filing for an immediate injunction to ban him from our lake." When she finished, looking expectantly at the crowd for applause, Sarah Jenkins stood up, her movements calm and precise, and placed a single, large map on the easel next to Brenda's projector screen, a map where the entire lake was shaded in bright, undeniable red. "Ms. Holloway," Sarah began, her voice projecting to the back of the room without a microphone, "you keep using the phrase 'our lake' and 'shared resources,' but I'm afraid there has been a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the geography of Silver Creek." "Sit down," Gavin shouted, standing up, his face flushing red. "You don't have the floor." "Actually," I said, standing up slowly, buttoning my jacket, "I do, because you're currently holding this meeting on a plot of land that borders my property, and you are discussing the regulation of a body of water that, according to the deed of trust dated 1962 and reaffirmed by the county assessor this morning, belongs entirely to me." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Brenda laughed, a shrill, nervous sound. "That's absurd. Nobody owns a lake." "Silas Thorne did," I said, pulling the certified deed from the briefcase and holding it up. "He bought the water column, the bed, and the navigation rights, which means, Brenda, that every time you take your kayak out, you are trespassing. Every dock that extends past the high water mark is an encroachment on my land. And your husband's plan to build a boat lift? That's construction on my private property." Sarah handed copies of the deed to the reporter, whose eyes went wide as he realized the story just shifted from crazy vet to HOA tyrant humiliated. And I watched the color drain from Brenda's face as the reality of the situation hit her like a freight train. She hadn't just sued the owner of the lake. She had sued him for using his own living room. I continued, my voice hard, looking directly into her panic-stricken eyes. Close this lake today. I could put up fences. I could charge you rent for every piling you've driven into my mud. I could bankrupt this entire association for 30 years of backdated usage fees. But I won't, I said, softening my tone as I looked around at the terrified neighbors. Because unlike you, Brenda, I don't get off on power. I want a community. The fallout was swift and brutal. Brenda resigned within 24 hours, citing health reasons, though we all knew it was shame. Gavin's political aspirations evaporated the moment the news segment aired, titled "The Man Who Owned the Lake," and the lawsuit was dropped so fast the paperwork probably caught fire from the friction. In the months that followed, we established the Silas Thorne Conservation Trust, ensuring that the lake would remain pristine and accessible to the neighbors, except for Brenda, who moved to a condo in Arizona, and I turned the illegal boat into a vessel for weekend tours, taking the very neighbors who once signed petitions against me out to see the sunset. Sitting on my dock now, watching Mia cast a fishing line into the gold-flecked water, I drink my coffee and think about justice, about how it isn't always about destruction, but sometimes about revelation. But it leaves me wondering, in a world where power so often goes unchecked, was I right to be merciful? When someone tries to destroy your life with a smile on their face and a rulebook in their hand, do you offer them an olive branch when you win, or do you burn the rulebook and let them drown in the ashes? What would you have done?